Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting some hanging dried flowers. This is pretty simple to paint since we're going to draw it firsthand, but like usual I'll also have the outline available in my coffee shop. So like usual I'm going to begin by sketching it out, and this is the reference image that I used, which I will also link in my description box. I really like the simplicity of this composition, and in this painting I also tried to simplify it further to make it look a bit more illustrative and two-dimensional. The first thing that I drew out here is the branch, so I can visualize the curve or the width, and I can also see the space that I have for the flowers underneath. When I draw out the strings holding the branch, I try to make it symmetrical by finding the center point, then connecting the point to both sides of the branch. After that, to figure out the spacing for the flowers, I try to indicate the spacing with the strings which will hold up the flowers evenly distributed on the branch. To make the drawing part a bit easier for the leaves and flowers, I rotated my book so you don't have to draw them upside down, and I just drew out similar types of leaves and flowers to the reference image and simplify it as best as I can. You can also include other flowers which might be your favorites, but personally I really like the combination of the textures here, so I'm sticking with these ones. Since the dimension of my paper is a bit longer than the reference image, I did try to adjust the placement, so instead of copying the exact amount of flowers in those exact spaces, I just tried to make this work with the space that I have. Here I'm erasing the top part of the eucalyptus leaves because I felt like the placement was a bit too long and I want there to be a bit more difference in the length of the hanging flowers, so I reduced the amount of leaves for a better flow in the composition. And in terms of the flowers, there are a lot of roses, but instead of drawing every single petal, I just focused on drawing the stems first to figure out the average length of the flowers in comparison to the ones that I've already drawn. Then I simplified the shapes of the flowers by drawing ovals to represent the whole shape. For these ones, I'm making frilly flower petal shapes, still very loosely since I want these flowers to be slightly different and a bit more open compared to the ovals or the closed-up roses that we made earlier. As for the smaller filler flowers, since it'll be too difficult to draw them one by one, I actually just drew out the stems to again figure out the length. Then I'm just going to freehand the flowers as I paint. Once I'm done with the sketch, I'm going to go over the colors. Here are the colors that I've chosen, but you can also pick different colors if you would like. So the first one here is Crimson Lake by Holbein, Chinese White by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke, Hooker's Green by Cotman, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, and I'll also be using Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martens. I'm also going to be outlining this with my Unipin Fineline, and this is in 01. It's a really nice light brown color, but you can use any color you have on hand. The first thing I'm going to paint are the eucalyptus leaves, and I want the color of the leaves to be a really nice cool green color. So the dominant color here is indigo and hooker's green with a bit of white to make it a bit more icy and pastel. Then I use a little bit of yellow as well as vermilion to mute the color slightly. Of course, since there are quite a lot of leaves, I'm going to create the green variations by using this green that I've mixed up as the main color, and I try to add a little bit of yellow or a little bit of white or any of the hues here to create a slightly different tone. I just want to make sure that I'm using the colors that I've already used to create the main green. This way the tonality of the green, even though they all look quite different, is still consistent with each other. Since all of the elements here that I'm painting are going to be quite small, I'm just going to stick with my size 0 brush. And this way it's much easier for me to paint around some of the leaves which are on top of each other and avoiding those negative spaces as well. So what I'm trying to do here as I'm painting, I try to paint the leaves which are not touching each other. This way I can leave them to dry completely before painting the ones next to them. And this can separate the colors instead of them bleeding into each other. I'm just going to keep painting on the leaves, and I'm going to try to show you as much of the color mixing process so you get a better idea. As you can see, I'm slowly running out of the green, and I'm going to make up more greens or even some browns. And you can actually change the dominant color if you want to make the leaves look a bit more dry, but even then they should still look consistent with the greener leaves since the brown is made out of the same colors in different ratios. This means I still included some of the green mixtures that I have on my palette, but just not as much as the new Gamboge and Vermilion in the ratio, as I want them to be a bit more dominant for the brown leaves. Once I'm done painting on the leaves, I'm going to move on to paint the flowers. And since I would still need to paint a bit more detail on the flowers, I decided to rotate my sketchbook again so it's a bit easier for me to visualize. Before I started painting, I also erased some of the lines to make it a little bit cleaner, and this way the lines won't distract me too much. In terms of the color, I'm going to be using a mix of New Gamboge and Chinese white for the flowers. Then for the leaves, I'm just going to use any green mixtures that I used for the previous leaves to make the colors consistent with each other. And I just pre-mixed these colors beforehand, so it's really easy to get to both of those color mixtures at the same time. To paint the flowers, I like to paint on the oval while also leaving a bit of negative lines following the curve to depict some separate petals. And I also like to make the top a little bit uneven instead of it looking like a smooth oval. I'm using a light consistency so they're quick to dry, and sometimes if I feel like a certain area is too wet, I just leave a bit of negative space surrounding that area so they don't all blend together. Once they're done, I'm going to paint on the sepals and the stem using the green that I've already pre-mixed. I used a dark green mixture this time, and I tried to paint really small leaves under the flowers for the sepals. As for the stems, I tried to use the tip of my brush and a very dry brush load, so it's much easier to control those thin lines. If you still have a bit of space, you can also add some leaves on the stem. Then at the bottom, I leave a bit of space for the rope. Then continue with the bottom part of the stem, which is angled in the opposite direction in different lengths. While I still have the dark green, I'm also going to use this to paint the stems in between the eucalyptus leaves. Once I'm done with the stems of the eucalyptus leaves, I'm going to move on to the next flower. As for the color, I'm going to reuse the light yellow color from Chinese white and New Gamboge, but this time I'm going to turn it into a peachy color by adding a touch of vermilion. Since I want these roses to be a bit more rosy in color, I added a little bit of Crimson Lake into the previous mixture, and again I'm using a thin consistency here while the surface is still a bit damp to paint the separate petal and also the bottom a little bit darker with the addition of the Crimson Lake. As for the sepals and the stems, I'm just going to use the same green with added Crimson Lake that's still in my brush, so the green is a little bit darker, but you can always adjust the green to your liking. Here I'm also going to add the details for the creamy roses by using a slightly darker value of the same color mixture, this time with a bit more vermilion in the mix to create something a little bit darker. And just like before, I'm painting very loosely at the bottom and also side of the petals, making sure to follow the curvature of each of those flowers. Once I'm done, I moved on to the next bunch of roses. For the base color, I just use a thin consistency of New Gamboge without the Chinese white this time, so the color is a bit brighter. As for the details, here I used almost a dry brush load and a medium consistency of a mix of New Gamboge and Vermilion to create this orange. This time I wanted the petals in the middle to be a bit darker, so I added more of the darker value there, and I also used the tip of my brush to sort of draw on each of the separate petals and some of the layered petals. If you're not used to drawing flowers freehand, you can also do this with pencil first, then go over it again with the orange mixture. But anyway, once I'm done, I used a clean damp brush to pull some of the colors inwards, so the difference in value becomes a little bit more subtle. After this, I'm going to paint on the sepals just like before. I'm painting on tiny leaves underneath, and the bottom is a little bit thicker than the top. I also used the green that I already have on my palette. Remember, you can always adjust the color if you want to make it a bit more brown instead of this dark green. I'm going to leave out the stems for now since most of them is going to be covered by the flowers in front. So I'm going to just paint on the base of these flowers. This time I made them a little bit more wide and I use a mix of New Gamboge, Chinese White, a bit of Crimson Lake, and Vermilion to create this peachy color. I made them bunch at the bottom and I made the top fan outwards and also have a little bit of an uneven edge for the frilly petals. As you can see, I've separated the color mixtures. There's a bit of the orange mix from New Gamboge and Vermilion with added Crimson Lake, and I'm going to add this to the peachy color for the base of the flowers, and this will just create a slightly darker value to add on a little bit more texture and details for the bottom of these flowers. For the color of the sepals, I decided to add a bit of Vermilion and Crimson Lake into the previous mixture to give it a slightly warmer tone without it being too brown. And I just feel like this will complement the pinkish tone of the flowers. And since these flowers are a bit wider, I decided to make the sepals a bit more flat instead of triangular to complement the shape of the flowers as well. For the next flower, I'm going to create a pastel purple color, and for this I'm going to use the peach that I already have on my palette with all of the reds that's still there, and I'm going to add a bit of indigo with extra Crimson Lake and a bit of Chinese White. Since these flowers are very tiny and you can't really see single ones, I'm just going to paint them as textures to suggest how they're growing out of the stem. Personally, I make them branch out on the left and right, and as I apply the paint, I try to not put too much pressure, so I'm just using the tip of my brush. This way those flowers look a little bit more delicate, but I still do want to play a little bit with the pressure to create those uneven edges. As I'm painting this, I'm using the stems that I drew out earlier as guidelines, and it's easier this way to follow where the angle of those textures should be, so they're still fanning out as a bouquet naturally. To make the composition more natural, I like to also play with the height, so some of them are a bit taller and some of them are a bit lower. I like to also place flowers in between the ones that I've already painted, so the stems of each flower doesn't look too long. Since I have a lot of reddish brown on my palette, I'm going to turn this into more of a green color by adding more indigo and a bit of New Gamboge and also a little bit of Chinese White to make the color a bit softer. And I'm going to use this to paint the stems very thinly, but because the flowers this time are quite delicate, I'm going to make even finer lines, so I do want to make sure that I have more or less a dry brush load. This way my brush comes to a very fine tip and it's much easier to control how fast the water flows out of the bristle. For some additional variation and also depth, I decided to layer on a bit of muted yellow-green by adding more New Gamboge into the green mixture that I used for the stem, and I like to use it to paint in between some of the flowers to indicate some younger budding flowers. On the very left, I'm going to create the same type of flower, but this time I want the purple to be a bit more pinkish, so I added more Crimson Lake and Chinese White into the mix. You can also alter the color as you would like, or change the colors altogether depending on your favorite palette. And basically I'm just going to apply the paint as I did before. Notice though, because the length of the stems are not too long this time, for the sake of composition, I won't drag out the flowers as far down as I did with the previous bouquet, so I'm adjusting what I paint according to the space that I have. Since I still have a lot of yellow-green on my palette, I'm going to use it to paint the stems, and I also feel like adding some smaller leaves which will grow out of some additional flowerless stems. I forgot about this one rose here, which I added because I felt like the rope or the string was a bit too long. So I'm just going to use new Gamboge in a thick consistency. Then I'm going to drag it outwards to paint the rest of the flower with a clean damp brush to soften part of the color for a bit of gradient. Since I've painted most of the flowers here, I'm just going to add some more additional touches like smaller leaves. Of course, the stems that I left out earlier here, now I can paint it behind the flowers that I've already painted. For this single rose, I'm also going to add a thick consistency of new Gamboge, and I try to drag it with a clean, dry brush just to create a bit more texture and definition. Next, I'm going to paint the tree branch, and since I have a lot of muted greens here, I'm just going to add some vermilion to turn it into a brown, and I also added a bit of new Gamboge to make the brown a bit lighter. I want to vary the color so it doesn't look so flat, so at the bottom here I added a darker brown, which has a bit more of the darker green from the bottom of my palette, or you can also add more indigo into your mixture. And on the left, I added a bit of Chinese white, and on the right I added more new Gamboge for more color variation. You can play around with this as much as you would like, but preferably I want the bottom part of the tree branch to be darker in value to create more of a three-dimensional form. Once the surface is more or less dry, I'm going to add some of the textures using more of the darker brown. Again, you can use the brown with added indigo or any of the dark green that you still have on your palette. And here I'm using a dry brush to create more of a rigid texture. And I'm just painting lines along the curve of the branch. So I got the part where I accidentally smudged some dark green, and since this paper is damaged, I can't take the paint off, so I'm just going to use bleed-proof white to erase it at the end. But please be careful with the darker colors. So for the string here, I used the same brown, but I added more new Gamboge and Chinese white to make a lighter brown color. And since we've painted most of the elements, feel free to add adjustments along the way. And also don't forget to paint the string, tying the bouquet of the dried flowers together. Since the dark green smudge was a bit too large and it was right in the middle of the painting, I impulsively decided to add some dried leaves to cover it up, which now I feel like it doesn't really add to the composition. So you can leave it out, or if you do like it, you can add it on too. As for the string tied on the dark branch, to make the lighter brown opaque and stand against the dark brown, I decided to add some bleed-proof white into the mixture. And while you're painting on the strings, please be mindful of the direction of the curves. On the left, the curve should be facing the left, and on the right, vice versa. In the middle, I try to direct the curves on both sides. So that's basically it for the painting portion. Since I've painted the flowers quite loosely, I decided to use a thin pen to draw out some of the petal details as well as some veins for the eucalyptus leaves. This is optional though. If you like the looser look, you can also leave it as is. Since I've painted most of the flowers freehand, I still understand that some of you would prefer to have the outlines of the flowers that I'm drawing out with pen at the moment. So for the outline that you can find in my coffee shop, it will include the flower petals that I'm outlining here. Lastly, after drawing on some of the outlines, I also decided to add some shadows to the side of the ropes because the opaque brown looks a bit too flat. So here I'm just using a dark brown to paint in between those curved lines. So that's basically it for this painting. If you enjoyed what you see today and would like to see more content like this, please consider subscribing. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!